The Dalton name had been buried long before any of them were. In the quiet hills of Claiborne County, people once whispered that the family carried a curse, a sickness of the blood that no sermon or science could cure. But in 1938, the whispers stopped. The county issued a formal decree declaring the Dalton bloodline cleansed. Their land was auctioned off, their farmhouse demolished, and the last of their kin moved away under new names. History folded the family into silence. In 1938, the Dalton name was finally pronounced clean. It was a strange sort of ceremony, one that took place not in a church or courthouse but in the narrow parlor of the county hall, lit by a single buzzing lamp. A few officials, weary from years of whispered complaints and mounting unease, gathered around an oak table to sign the declaration. The words were simple enough: the Dalton bloodline is henceforth declared cleansed of all ancestral afflictions. Yet to those who lived in Claiborne County, that single line carried the weight of decades of superstition, death, and fear. For generations, the Daltons had been the town's most unsettling mystery. Their farm, once thriving, had become a hollow place of decay, its windows dark, its fields growing wild. People spoke of screams in the night and shadows moving where no one walked. Livestock near their property died without reason, and travelers avoided the road that cut past their house, swearing they saw figures watching from the porch long after the family was thought gone. The talk of tainted blood began in the late 1800s, when 3 Dalton children died within months of one another. No doctor could agree on a cause. Their skin had turned pale as wax, their eyes glassy and unblinking. Some said it was a disease unknown to medicine, others whispered it was something passed down, something not meant to exist in human veins. The town's elders, desperate to end the unease, began keeping records, tracking every Dalton birth and death like an infection they hoped to contain. By the time the 1930s arrived, the family had dwindled to 2 aging siblings, Ezra and Lillian Dalton, who lived alone in the crumbling farmhouse their ancestors built. When they died within days of each other, the county wasted no time. Officials gathered their remains, sealed the house, and burned the surrounding crops to ash. No funeral was held, and no family came to claim them. Declaring the bloodline cleansed was as much an act of superstition as it was of relief. It allowed the townspeople to sleep again, to speak of the Daltons as a story that had finally ended. In truth, the declaration was hollow, a document meant to bury memory rather than bodies. The sheriff signed it with a trembling hand, and the witnesses avoided looking at the wax-sealed page. Outside, a heavy fog rolled in from the hills, settling over the Dalton property like a shroud. Some said they heard faint whispers that night, others the sound of a child laughing before it faded into the dark woods. But by morning, Claiborne County considered the matter closed, and the Daltons, for the first time in living memory, were officially forgotten. In the summer of 1993, the Dalton name surfaced again, not through rumor but through the dry scrape of shovels against earth. A construction crew widening the old highway that wound past Dalton Hill hit something solid beneath the clay, not rock, but wood. At first, they assumed it was just another forgotten fence post or animal trap buried by time. But as the foreman cleared away the dirt, the outline of a small coffin began to appear. It was no longer than a child's body, the wood darkened and crumbling from decades underground. When one of the workers brushed away the last layer of soil, he froze. Carved into the lid was a faint symbol, a looping circle intersected by a downward cross, identical to the crest that had once marked the Dalton family's gate. None of the men knew its meaning, but the air around them seemed to grow heavier as they stared at it. The sheriff was called in, along with a coroner from the nearest town. The coffin was lifted carefully from the ground and placed on a tarp. When it was opened, the stench of rot was weaker than expected, as though time itself had been reluctant to touch what lay inside. The remains were small, unmistakably those of a child, wrapped in what looked like an old homespun blanket. The face was gone, but something about the way the body had been laid to rest felt deliberate, almost ceremonial. The coroner noticed a small iron coin resting on the child's chest, engraved with the same looping symbol from the lid. There were no markings, no name, nothing to identify who it had been or why it had been buried alone on the outskirts of town. The county archives were consulted, but there was no record of any burial on that land. The old maps labeled the area as part of the Dalton estate, long before the farmhouse was burned down and the soil declared purified. The workers, uneasy and eager to leave, insisted on halting construction for the day. But before the coffin could be moved to the morgue, a sudden wind swept across the site, scattering dust and paper like a storm. One of the crew swore he heard the faint sound of whispering beneath the wind, a child's voice, repeating something too low to understand. By nightfall, word had spread through Claiborne County that a Dalton grave had been uncovered. The sheriff ordered the site sealed, but curiosity spread faster than caution. Locals gathered at the edge of the field, peering at the disturbed ground as if expecting something to crawl out. It had been 55 years since the county declared the Dalton bloodline cleansed, and yet the earth itself seemed to disagree. Eleanor Griggs had always been drawn to forgotten histories, the kind of stories that existed only in brittle newspapers and faded family photographs. In the fall of 1993, she arrived in Claiborne County with little more than a camera, a notebook, and an obsession with the Dalton name. She wasn't a native, nor did she have any connection to the family, but she had come across their story while researching lost American bloodlines for a regional history documentary. The phrase, "declared cleansed," caught her attention immediately. It sounded less like a bureaucratic act and more like an exorcism. The deeper she looked, the stranger it became: no birth records after 1938, no living descendants, and no trace of what led the county to make such an announcement. To Eleanor, the Daltons were the perfect mystery, erased, silent, and incomplete. Her research began at the Claiborne Public Library, where the town's few surviving archives were stored in a locked basement. The librarian, an old man who spoke in short, nervous sentences, seemed reluctant to hand her the key. "Some stories don't want to be found," he warned, half smiling as if it were a joke, though his hands trembled as he passed her the metal key. Down in the dust-filled basement, Eleanor found what she was looking for, a box marked Dalton Property, 1892 to 1938. Inside were brittle ledgers, coroner reports, and a handful of photographs showing the Dalton farmhouse, stern-faced family portraits, and one haunting image of a young boy staring directly into the camera. The boy's eyes were strangely sharp, as though aware of something the others weren't. Each night, Eleanor returned to her rented cabin at the edge of Dalton Hill to review her notes. She noticed strange inconsistencies. Official records listed 5 Dalton children, yet photographs showed 6. The extra child was never named, only appearing in 2 images before vanishing from all later documents. Curious, she asked locals about it, but most shrugged off the question or changed the subject entirely. The older residents grew quiet when she mentioned the Daltons, their expressions darkening like people recalling a nightmare they had agreed to forget. One elderly woman at the grocery store whispered that the Dalton name should stay buried, because some roots grow best in the dark. Still, Eleanor pressed on. She had uncovered something too large to ignore: a forgotten grave, a missing child, and a family the county had tried to erase from memory. Her instincts told her there was more to the cleansing than superstition. Somewhere in the yellowed pages and unmarked graves, a secret waited. And like all secrets left too long in silence, it was beginning to stir. By the beginning of 1994, Eleanor Griggs had become consumed by the Dalton mystery. She no longer viewed it as simple research; it had become something personal, a quiet obsession that gnawed at her mind day and night. Each fragment she uncovered seemed to lead nowhere and everywhere at once. The death records were inconsistent, the birth certificates half-legible, and the official, cleansing, declaration was missing from the county archives entirely. Every lead ended in silence, as though someone had carefully erased the trail. Then, one evening in late February, while combing through an old family Bible that had been donated to the Historical Society decades earlier, she found something wedged between 2 pages of brittle scripture, a lock of hair, bound tightly with a red thread. The inscription beneath it read only, "Abel, 1902. The handwriting was delicate, unmistakably feminine, likely that of Lillian Dalton, the last woman known to live on the property. Eleanor hesitated before touching it. The hair was pale, almost white, and so well preserved that it seemed untouched by time. She immediately thought of DNA testing, a way to confirm once and for all whether this belonged to the same Dalton line the county had tried to erase. It was supposed to be a straightforward process, something scientific and objective, free from the eerie folklore that clung to the name. She sealed the sample in a sterile envelope, labeled it carefully, and mailed it to a laboratory in Louisville that specialized in historical genealogy. The technician on the phone assured her the results would take a few weeks. Eleanor felt a strange sense of triumph as she hung up. She was certain this test would finally shed light on who the Daltons really were. But as the days passed, she began to feel uneasy. Her phone would ring late at night, and when she answered, there would be nothing but static. The Bible she had taken the hair from sometimes lay open to different pages in the morning, though she always closed it before sleeping. A cold draft lingered in her cabin despite the windows being shut tight. Still, she pushed the unease aside and focused on her work, telling herself that truth and fear often shared the same space. Weeks later, when the envelope from the lab finally arrived, she felt her hands tremble before she even opened it. The report inside was thin, only 2 pages, but what it said made her blood run cold. The sample was indeed human, but the genetic structure showed anomalies no scientist could explain. The lab's note at the bottom was short and clinical, yet deeply unsettling. Sample shows non-standard markers, not consistent with known human DNA. The moment Eleanor unfolded the report, a stillness settled over her cabin, as if the air itself was holding its breath. She read the lines once, then again, refusing to believe what she was seeing. The DNA from the Dalton hair sample didn't match any known human pattern. The report described sequences that defied classification, with genetic markers that didn't correspond to any reference in modern databases. It wasn't just a family outlier, it was something else entirely. At first, she assumed there had been a mistake at the lab, perhaps contamination or a mislabeled sample. But when she called the technician who had processed the test, his tone was nervous and hesitant. He told her that 2 other samples, both from unidentified remains found years apart in the same region, had shown identical anomalies. The unsettling part was that both those remains belonged to children buried under unmarked graves, and both had been exhumed under mysterious circumstances. Eleanor demanded to know where those samples had come from. The technician reluctantly provided vague information. One was recovered in 1956 from a washed-out cemetery near Claiborne Creek, and the other in 1978 from a collapsed root cellar behind an abandoned farmhouse. Neither had been identified, and both were logged away as unknown minors. The matching genetic patterns between the Daltons and those nameless children couldn't be explained by coincidence. The lab worker admitted he was disturbed by the results and said quietly before hanging up, "Whatever you're studying, ma'am, maybe let it rest." That night, Eleanor spread the reports across her desk, cross-referencing dates, locations, and old maps of the Dalton property. Every site where anomalous remains had been discovered lay within a 10-mile radius of Dalton Hill. It was as if the land itself had trapped pieces of the same bloodline, scattered across generations. Her mind raced through possibilities: genetic mutation, rare disease, or some inbred lineage the town had tried to cover up. But deep down, she knew it was something darker. The Daltons hadn't been cleansed, they had been contained. Sleep refused to come. When she finally closed her eyes, she dreamed of pale children standing in the fog, their faces hidden, their voices overlapping in whispers she couldn't understand. She woke at 3:12 a.m., the papers fluttering in a wind that shouldn't have existed, the windows were closed, the night perfectly still. On her desk, the DNA report had shifted slightly. The page that once lay blank now bore a faint smudge near the edge, a small print the color of dried earth, the size of a child's hand. Eleanor couldn't stop thinking about the name that kept appearing in her notes, Abel Dalton. At first, she assumed it was a common family name, passed down like tradition, but the more she examined the records, the more it troubled her. In every generation she could trace, there was always an Abel Dalton. The years between them stretched unevenly, sometimes 20, sometimes 40, but each record ended the same way: the child vanished before reaching the age of 13. No graves were listed, no death certificates filed, only quiet absences that no one ever explained. She cross-checked census records, family ledgers, and church documents, and every source repeated the pattern like a curse written in ink. The first Abel appeared in 1821, the next in 1857, then 1889, 1902, and finally, the last mention in 1937. After that, the name disappeared, just as the bloodline supposedly had. She tried to rationalize it, telling herself it was a coincidence, maybe a tragic family superstition where the name carried bad luck. But then she noticed something else: the faces. In the few surviving photographs of the Dalton children, each boy named Abel looked eerily similar: pale skin, sharp eyes, a narrow jaw, and the same unsettling half-smile, as if they all shared the same consciousness wearing different generations of flesh. The resemblance was too precise to ignore. When she compared these images side by side, she realized their features were almost identical, down to a small scar on the chin visible in two separate photos taken decades apart. It wasn't possible, yet it was there, printed in fading silver nitrate and shadow. Driven by the need for clarity, Eleanor visited the county's oldest churchyard where the Daltons were rumored to have been buried. Most of the stones were broken or unreadable, but near the back of the overgrown lot, she found a small, unmarked headstone carved only with the same looping symbol she had seen on the coffin lid, a circle intersected by a downward cross. Kneeling, she brushed away the moss, and for a moment, she thought she heard something behind her, the soft sound of a child humming. When she turned, the cemetery was empty, though the air carried a chill sharp enough to make her hands tremble. She returned to her cabin shaken, unable to rid herself of the image of those identical faces. The repetition of the name Abel across time felt deliberate, as though the family had been trying to resurrect something over and over again. Each child was born, lived briefly, and then disappeared, leaving behind only fragments of blood, whispers in the soil, and the growing suspicion that perhaps there had never been multiple Abels at all. Perhaps there had only ever been one. The nights around Dalton Hill grew different after Eleanor uncovered the truth about the Abels. The air felt charged, heavy with a silence that pressed against her ears. She had grown used to the loneliness of her rented cabin, but lately, it no longer felt empty. The forest outside seemed to shift with her every breath, branches creaked though there was no wind, and the gravel path leading up to her porch always looked freshly disturbed in the morning, as if someone had been pacing there while she slept. She told herself it was nerves, the mind's way of playing tricks after too many sleepless nights and too much time spent among graves and forgotten stories. But when she began hearing the voices, she knew something had changed. It started faintly, like echoes of laughter carried from a distance. Children's laughter. Soft, fleeting, and strangely rhythmic, as though coming from a game being played far away. She would hear it just before sleep, a burst of giggles, the scrape of tiny footsteps on wooden floors, and then silence. At first, she dismissed it as memory or fatigue, but soon the sounds grew clearer. Some nights, she could make out faint whispers beneath her window, voices too quiet to form words, but their tones unmistakably familiar, curious, playful, and wrong. The kind of laughter that didn't belong to the living. One evening, determined to prove herself wrong, Eleanor left her tape recorder running through the night. When she played the tape back the next morning, her heart pounded. The recording began normally, the ticking of the clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint rustle of wind outside. Then, around 2:17 a.m., came a low, dragging sound, followed by soft footsteps. A moment later, the unmistakable sound of children laughing filled the room. It wasn't distant this time, it was near, echoing as if the laughter came from inside the cabin itself. Then, abruptly, one of the voices whispered a word so faint she barely caught it, her name. Eleanor sat frozen, staring at the recorder as the room around her grew unbearably quiet. Her reflection in the dark window seemed to shift slightly, as though another face were standing just behind her. The next night, she slept with the lights on, but that didn't help. The laughter came anyway, mixed with the whisper of leaves brushing against the siding. It always stopped when she spoke, vanishing as if it had never existed. By dawn, she began to realize that the voices weren't trying to frighten her. They were calling to her, inviting her back to something the Dalton bloodline had never escaped. The morning after the recordings, Eleanor drove straight to the county archives, her nerves frayed and her hands trembling around the steering wheel. She needed something tangible, some evidence that could anchor what she was experiencing in logic. The Claiborne County Archives were housed in the basement of the courthouse, a dim space lined with iron shelves and boxes marked by fading ink. She had already gone through most of it weeks earlier, but something told her she had missed a detail, something hidden in the paperwork surrounding the 1938 cleansing declaration. When she arrived, the clerk looked surprised to see her again but handed over the key without question. The moment she opened the storage door, the smell of smoke hit her. Half the shelves were blackened, their papers curled and brittle from heat. It looked as though someone had set fire to them recently, not enough to spread, but enough to destroy entire sections of history. Eleanor sifted through the damage, coughing as ash clung to her fingers. The files labeled Dalton property were among the worst burned. Only scraps remained, a few signatures, a line or two of text, and one page half-scorched at the bottom. Most of the words were lost to the flames, but one phrase remained legible: blood renewed. The price, $1 per line. She read it over and over, feeling the words burn deeper with every repetition. It wasn't the language of a legal document, it sounded like a ritual. Her first instinct was to take the page to the sheriff's office, but something in her gut warned her not to. The destruction felt deliberate, too precise to be accidental. Someone had come here to erase a truth, not a myth. While gathering the remaining fragments, she noticed that the edges of some burned pages were smeared with an oily residue, as though something wet had touched them even after the fire. When she lifted one to her nose, it carried the faint metallic scent of blood. A low hum filled the room then, faint but rising, like distant chanting. She turned off the overhead light and listened, holding her breath. The sound faded, replaced by the soft creak of floorboards from somewhere above. She was sure she was alone in the basement, yet she felt watched, as if someone were standing behind the rows of shelves. She grabbed the torn page and fled. Outside, the afternoon sun did nothing to calm her. In her car, the words on the burned paper seemed to move when the light hit them, the ink shifting like it was alive. $1 per line. For the first time, Eleanor began to believe that the Dalton Curse wasn't a story about blood, it was a story about payment. Eleanor spent days staring at the burned page, unable to decide whether to destroy it or protect it. The phrase, $1 per line, echoed through her mind, connecting everything she had uncovered: the repeating name of Abel, the missing children, the strange DNA, the laughter in the dark. But one question remained: if the Dalton bloodline had truly ended, then why did the pattern seem to continue? She decided to trace modern genealogical databases, comparing the Dalton records to current residents of the surrounding counties. It took her 3 sleepless nights, poring over census data and birth registries, before she found something impossible. A man named Michael Dalton, age 42, living less than 30 miles away in a small, isolated house on the outskirts of Blackwood Township. No other relatives listed, no occupation, and no family photographs attached to any public record. The name had appeared quietly, like a ghost that had slipped back into the world unnoticed. Eleanor felt both dread and relief. If Michael was truly a descendant, he could confirm whether the bloodline had somehow survived. She called the number listed under his name, and after several rings, a man's voice answered. It was deep, calm, and strangely familiar, as if she had heard it before in her dreams. When she introduced herself and mentioned the Dalton family, there was a long silence. Then, in a tone devoid of surprise, he said, "You shouldn't have gone digging, Miss Griggs. Some things stay buried for a reason." Before she could respond, he ended the call. That night, she couldn't sleep. Every shadow in her cabin seemed to stretch toward her, every creak of the wood felt deliberate. Around midnight, she heard faint tapping on the window. When she looked outside, the forest was motionless, yet a figure seemed to stand near the tree line, tall, still, and watching. She closed the curtains, heart pounding, but when she turned around, the phone on her desk began to ring again. The caller ID showed unknown, yet when she answered, no one spoke. Only the faint hum of static and, beneath it, the sound of children whispering her name. By morning, she decided she had no choice but to meet Michael Dalton in person. She printed every note, photograph, and report she had collected and packed them into a box. Before leaving, she glanced once more at the burned paper lying on her desk. The ink had darkened overnight, the words clearer now than before, as though rewritten by invisible hands. She traced the final line with her finger and felt a chill crawl down her spine. Blood renewed. The price, 1 soul per line. For the first time, she feared she knew whose soul it would be next. The drive to Blackwood Township felt endless. The road wound through miles of dead forest, the trees black and skeletal against the winter sky. Eleanor's headlights cut through a mist that seemed to grow thicker the closer she got to Michael Dalton's address. The GPS flickered out halfway there, leaving her to follow a dirt path that barely looked like a road. When she finally reached the property, she saw a small house at the end of a clearing, its windows dark, its walls gray with rot. There were no signs of life, no car, no lights, not even footprints in the frost. For a long moment, she sat in her car, engine running, wondering if she had made a mistake. But curiosity, the same force that had driven her through months of fear, pushed her to the door. When she knocked, there was no answer. The house seemed abandoned, yet the faint smell of smoke lingered in the cold air. She knocked again, harder, and this time, the door creaked open on its own. Inside, the air was heavy and still. Dust coated the furniture, and faint symbols, circles crossed with downward lines, were carved into the wood of the doorframes. She called out his name, her voice echoing off the empty walls. Then, from deeper inside the house, a man's voice answered calmly, "You found it." Eleanor followed the sound to the living room. There, sitting in an old wooden chair, was Michael Dalton. His face was pale, expressionless, his eyes reflecting the dim light like glass. On the wall behind him, carved deep into the plaster, was the same looping symbol she had seen on the grave and the burned paper. Dozens of them, layered over one another, forming a pattern that seemed to pulse when the shadows shifted. Michael spoke softly, never looking directly at her. "The cleansing never ended," he said. "They thought they could stop it by erasing the blood, but it doesn't die. It waits. It calls." He told her that every generation was marked, one child born to carry the blood forward, one soul taken to keep it alive. When Eleanor asked who decided that, his lips curved into a faint smile. "The blood decides," he said. Before she could respond, the lights flickered. The air grew cold, her breath visible. From the corners of the room came a faint sound, children's laughter, soft and close. Michael stood and stepped aside, revealing a small wooden box on the table. The lid was carved with the Dalton symbol. "You've been chosen," he whispered. Eleanor's pulse quickened as she backed away, but the laughter grew louder, surrounding her. The last thing she saw before everything went dark was Michael's calm expression as he said, "The line must continue."